Europe is selling weapons under the nose of the EU, and it's not, strictly speaking, legal.
President Emmanuel Macron has defended French weapons sales to the Saudi-led coalition fighting in Yemen.
New Saudi investment, £65 billion.
Germany must continue to insist on the importance of human rights.
I want to tell you a story about how Europe is selling weapons of war to all the wrong places. It's a story about how, instead of the EU stopping what they say is illegal, the EU is not only working with the companies selling the weapons, it is now itself becoming militarized to try to profit off of these arms sales. Europe accounts for more than 26% of arms exports in the world. Now that might not sound like too much, but if you exclude the US and Russia, Europe is responsible for more than 2/3 of the rest of the weapon sales in the world. Almost all of these weapons are sold by just 4 nations in Europe: France, Germany, Italy and Great Britain. Most of these exports are for North Africa and the Middle East, but by far the biggest buyer of European-made arms is Saudi Arabia. Recently, Saudi Arabia has increased their weapons imports by 61% and neighboring countries like Qatar by 361%. That is such a massive amount of extra weapons going to those countries. So business is booming and the European companies making these weapons are making tons of money. This is where things start to get a little sinister. The Saudi-backed coalition has carried out more than 20,000 airstrikes in Yemen by now. More than 1/3 of all of these attacks hit civilian targets. It has led to one of the greatest humanitarian crises on our planet, and it's still going on right now. Most of these attacks are carried out with freshly supplied weapons from the US and, more importantly, Europe. In other words, these European weapons manufacturers selling weapons to Saudi Arabia are well aware of what's going on in Yemen, and they keep selling anyways.
We can't physically or forcibly follow this equipment for years on end because they are made to last, sometimes even decades. That's an issue that we can't really control. What I want to make clear is that the defense industry in general, the European and French defense industry, is responsible and abides by the rules.
Now get this, both the United Nations and the European Parliament, meaning the EU, has formally condemned the sales to Saudi Arabia and asked them to stop due to the war in Yemen. You know, like grotesque human rights violations and all of that. In fact, the EU has already passed arms embargoes on these weapon sales 3 times. And each time the weapon sales have increased right after. When these arms embargoes were voted for and passed, you'll notice a surprising amount of absentee votes. These are, among others, blank votes from the French and the Italian politicians. But why would any EU politician, knowing what these weapons are used for, not vote for these arms embargoes? So it turns out that the biggest shareholders of these private companies selling weapons to Saudi Arabia are often the governments of nations within the EU. What? Let me say that again. The EU has passed arms embargoes condemning what Saudi Arabia is doing in Yemen. At the same time, the same countries get paid for continuing to send major weapons to them by sharing revenue with these private companies. Okay, so I'm sure you have a lot of questions. Trade embargoes, the EU, the European Parliament, So let me show you what it means by taking a closer look at France. France has signed massive contracts of weapons deals with Saudi Arabia. And by France, I mean the French private companies. Most of the time, countries like France will be major stockholders in the private companies selling these weapons. So in that way, the governments are making money indirectly from all of these weapon sales. Which, explains why the French MEPs refuse to vote for these arms embargoes. Business is just too good, and there's just too much money to be made. So by now, France is the 3rd biggest arms exporter to Saudi Arabia. Oh, by the way, also the 2nd biggest arms exporter to Qatar, the UAE, Egypt and China. So while other countries in Europe and even Russia and China have scaled down their exports in recent years, France is ramping it up by 3 times the amount of the US percentage-wise. That means more weapons exported to Saudi Arabia in a time where the Yemen crisis is getting worse. So all of these weapons are often freighted with ships from the national shipping company of Saudi Arabia, Bahri Shipping. This specific ship was sailing from France and headed to Saudi Arabia as its tracking went offline near Sardinia in Italy. But video live stream confirmed that the ship docked in Sardinia. You can't say for sure why the tracking went offline, but it does suggest that even more weapons deals are being made than what is publicly known. There also might be several good reasons why you would want to keep weapons deals coming out of Italy as secret as possible.
The Italian law on arms export is one of the most restrictive ones in Europe, and it prohibits export to countries engaged in armed conflict, and Saudi Arabia and its coalition members are engaged in an armed conflict.
Italy, just like the other nations, might be breaking international law as well, that forbids weapons exports where there's evidence of significant human rights violations, just like in Yemen. There are politicians in open opposition to Italy supplying Saudi Arabia with more bombs as well.
L'Arabia Saudita utilizzerà questi armamenti per bombardare le popolazioni civili dello Yemen.
Si parla di 8.000 bombe solo in un anno. Era obbligato il ministro degli esteri a dare questa autorizzazione, poteva anche dire di no.
Even though sales are officially condemned by the government in the EU, they provide police and fire escorts for the Saudi ships along the way. Leonardo is based in Italy and they are the world's 12th biggest weapons producer. 12th. The Italian government owns 30% of that private company. The country and the company might be different, but the pattern is the same. RMW is another massive weapons supplier in Germany.
Security. It's the feeling of being reliably protected. The basis for economic growth and prosperity.
RMW sells the Saudis this Mk80 series of bombs. They weigh up to 1 ton. They can be identified by this A4447 number. These bombs have been found all over civilian targets in Yemen, including town squares and houses. It's been well documented how all of these governments who are part of the EU provide fire and police escorts for these shipments. So it's not like they're unaware of what's going on in that regard either. Actually, a shipment to Saudi Arabia will often go through multiple countries, which require the governments of those countries to be on board with it, all while protesting it in public at the same time.
Operano nel rispetto della legge.
Operano nel rispetto della legge, certo.
So now it's beginning to make sense why you sometimes see articles like these in mainstream news. None of this should technically be legal, but no one seems to have the political willpower to change anything, so in the end, does legality really matter? Alright, so they passed these arms embargoes in the European Parliament to stop these arm deals, right? They passed them in the UK Parliament and other places as well, but they end up being toothless in terms of actually stopping the trades. You see, these governmentally subsidized private companies consider these arms embargoes more guidelines than laws. In other words, they understand that no one actually has any power or political will to enforce these laws. On top of that, many MEPs abstain from voting for these embargoes. They openly refuse to vote for something that would stop these arms sales to countries that commit war crimes. The reasons for politicians not to vote for these arms embargoes is difficult to understand. I mean, why wouldn't they? So I looked into it and I found out that within the EU, there's a good portion of politicians that believe that the EU should become militarized. They even want to take over these illegal arms deals themselves. The idea of the EU becoming militarized is extremely unpopular with the people of Europe. But not with some of these politicians, in spite of the fact that they are representing us in the European Parliament. So this is where things begin to get a little crazy. One of the founding principles of the EU is to prohibit the EU's budget for operations having, quote, military or defense implications. But that principle was reduced to rubble recently with the founding of the EPF, the European Peace Facility. So that's a good name, right? I mean, we all want peace, but it turns out the EPF will almost exclusively have offensive military purposes. That means that for the first time in history, the EU will have budget lines for military components. This European Peace Facility was activated recently in July 2021 and will have an initial budget of more than 5 billion euros. That money will be spent providing equipment and training, but here's the important part. For the first time in the history of the EU, money will also be spent providing weapons to non-European military forces around the world. Did you catch that? The EU has created an agency that will now actively take part in selling weapons to countries, in spite of them passing by a majority continuous arms embargoes against it. Instead of dismantling these sales from businesses to other countries, they actually want to overtake some of the business and become the weapons dealers themselves. This article from The Guardian talks about this, and it states that the measures will also benefit the European arms industry by providing research and development funds and new outlets for arms sales overseas. So at this point you might be wondering why you haven't heard anything about this. It seems like a pretty big deal, actually like a huge deal. The problem is that this is happening incrementally. Let me break it down for you. The European Union was never meant to be an arms trader, but that all changed with a seemingly insignificant project called the Pilot Project. The Pilot Project was the first of its kind within the EU that aimed to make use of AI to take over the urban battlefield in various ways. It consists mainly of these three projects that are all AI prototypes of military warfare: inside building awareness and navigation for urban warfare, standardization of remotely piloted aircraft systems, the RPAS, and detect and avoid, the TRAVA, unmanned heterogeneous swarm of sensor platforms, the Euro swarm. The people behind the pilot project were so successful that it paved the way to the EU providing a whopping 5.7 billion euros for new similar projects. So the pilot project only had a funding of around 1.5 million euros, but the EPF now has a funding of 5.7 billion, which is 4,300 times what they had just spent. So it went from being very experimental to now being a fully fledged research department within the EU that almost no one have probably ever even heard about. They now deal with a much wider array of projects, but they all have this thing in common: they are military in nature. These are currently the biggest projects within the European Peace Facility. Directed energy weapons, adaptive camouflage, real-time cyber threat hunting, quantum technologies, and advanced artificial intelligence for warfare. See where this is going? Over a very short duration, the EU has gone from being a non-militarized organization to being one, without almost anyone knowing about it. This organization, called the International Federation of Human Rights, is noticing the obvious in a joint statement they made with over 40 civil rights groups. 5 billion European peace facility risks fueling conflict and human rights violations around the world. So it's really weird to see this happening, because the EU becoming militarized is not the will of the people within the EU. It looks to be happening because there are politicians within the EU that believe that the Union should have its own army, that individual countries' armies are not strong enough to confront a potential future war, that the EU needs to become a superpower to not be dependent on other superpowers in the world. Which is why they are proposing that all of these new military projects will be paid for by all of the member nations. If everyone pays for it, it becomes everyone's army. They seem to hope that by doing it this way incrementally, people will more easily accept it, or even worse, not even notice it at all, which obviously is a little bit manipulative. It almost feels like these people within the EU with a lot of power understood that the illegal weapon sales were going to happen no matter what. So instead of stopping it, they would just kinda join it or even completely overtake it. Meanwhile, the attacks in Yemen is just going to continue. The European countries did briefly stop the sales to Saudi Arabia when reports came out that a third of these 20,000 airstrikes were hitting civilian targets. A third of them. Saudi Arabia quickly explained that the pilots simply lacked the proper training, and then for no apparent reason the US and Europe began selling arms to Saudi Arabia again, enabling the massacres in Yemen. So the truth is that these arms sales are not going to stop for the foreseeable future. But the difference is it could now well soon be ordered by the EU instead of these private companies.